In the summer of 1943, the Third Reich was located in a critical situation. After the failure in Stalingrad and the defeat in the north of Africa, Germany had lost the strategic initiative. The Wurmch is he was facing a war on two fronts, and the east, the Red Army was advancing with ever-increasing force. In Thuist, the Allies were preparing the landing in Italy and shortly afterwards, in France. The German economy was exhausted. The Allied bombings they reduced factories, cities, and railways ironclad to rubble. The Luftwaffe had passed of dominating the skies of Europe to struggle to survive. In that context, the Nazi leaders resorted to an idea which became a fundamental part of their propaganda. The Wunderwaffe weapons miraculous, as Joseph promised Goebbels were going to change the course of the war and return to Germany the lost superiority. The notion of the secret weapon wasn't new, but in the Third Reich reached a dimension special. Hitler, obsessed with the technology, he was convinced that only a revolutionary invention could give it victory. This belief fueled a series of ambitious projects: tanks gigantic, cannons of unprecedented range, colossal submarines, airplanes off reaction, and even experiments with energy weapons and nuclear projects. However, most of these developments encounter the harsh reality: lack of resources, problems technical, production times impossible, and a military situation ever increasingly desperate. While the propaganda showed sketches and promise of a future filled with invincible weapons, on the front lines, the soldiers suffered shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. This documentary will explore precisely those projects that never achieved success. Great ideas, which in many cases remained in prototypes or simple blueprints. Throughout this series we will see how the Hitler's dream of saving the war with technology faced the reality of a collapsing Reich. More beyond the technical fascination, these stories are also a lesson about the limits of innovation in times of war, because no machine, by however advanced it may be, it can replace the combination of strategy, logistics, and collective will that really defines the victory. In 1943, while the V2 rockets were still in development, the German engineers they started another ambitious project, the fifth three-pump, also known as their railgun or high-pressure gun. A difference from the fifth one and V2, which were missiles propelled by engines, the fifth three was a gigantic cannon designed to launch long-range projectiles distance using a multiple system of explosive charges along its tube. The principle was ingenious. In place of a single explosion that would push the projectile, the fifth one used multiple secondary loads placed in chambers along the canyon that they were turning on sequentially when the projectile passed in front of them. The explosion added speed, allowing that the projectile reached speeds far superior to those of a cannon conventional. On paper, this meant that Germany could bombard London from the coast French, more than 160 kilometers away. The idea thrilled Hitler, who saw in the fifth three a kind of superweapon capable of terrorizing the population British and forced Churchill to negotiate. The Nazis began the construction of a huge complex in Mimoix, in northern France, where they planned to install several batteries V3 underground. Each cannon would have up to 130 m long, and the whole thing was designed to launch hundreds of projectiles a day on the British capital. However, the problems were enormous. The system was extremely difficult to begin with. Complex. Coordinate the explosion secondary school was difficult, and the accuracy left much to be desired. Projectiles of about 140 kilograms had impressive theoretical scope, but in practice, the cannon proved insufficient, reliable, and vulnerable. In 1944, Allied intelligence discovered the project thanks to reports from the French resistance and photographs airlines. In July of that same year, British Lancaster bombers, equipped with the enormous Talby pumps of 5 tons, attacked the complex of Mimoix. The impact was devastating. The underground galleries remained destroyed and the project was left practically cancelled before engine service. Although they were built some smaller prototypes and used in a limited way against Luxembourg in the last months of the war, the 5th TR never fulfilled his original objective. It was an example perfect of how ambitions Hitler's excessive policies clashed with the reality of modern warfare. The cannon Riel's attempt represented the attempt desperate from Germany to find a weapon of massive psychological effect, but it ended up being a monument to failure. The technological idea was advanced for its time, but its practical application it proved impossible in a rage that it was collapsing. Among the most extravagant of the Third Reich find the Panzer Kampfwagen 8 Maus, a supertank designed to be the heaviest armored vehicle ever built. Conceived in 1942 under the directed by Ferdinand Porsche and approved personally by Hitler, the Maus had towing around 188 tons. In comparison, the most Allied tanks heavyweights of the era, like Churchill British or the M26 Pershing American, they were around 40-45 tons. The Maus was designed as an indestructible tank, armor frontal up to 240 mm, main gun 128 mm, accompanied by a secondary 75 mm and space for 5 crew. In theory, no weapons-existing anti-tank weapons could penetrate their steel plates. Hitler imagined it like a machine capable of destroying the enemy defenses and clear the way to the German infantry. However, the reality was very different. Its size colossal generated enormous problems logistics. The Maus couldn't cross the most of the bridges and move it. It required special solutions such as deep-sea rail transport adapted. Its engine, despite the Porsche's attempts to design versions hybrids, it was unable to move with efficiency similar to mass. The maximum speed barely reached 20 km/h, which made him an easy target for artillery and aircraft enemies. Only 2 were built. Prototypes. The first one was completed in 1943 and the second in 1944, none of them engaged in actual combat. First it was used for testing, and the second it was destroyed by its own crew in 1945 to avoid capture. After the war, the Soviets recovered parts of both prototypes and assembled a unique one that is still on display today in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. Project Maus demonstrated the extent to which Hitler's megalomania had exceeded the actual needs of the war. Instead of investing in tanks tested like the Panzer IV or the Panzer, that could be mass-produced and maintain the fight on the front lines, the industry Germany lost time and resources in a vehicle that was never used practical. More than a weapon, the Maus was a symbol of the strategic failure of Third Reich, a steel monster that, although impressive in the plans, was doomed to ineffectiveness in the battlefield. While the United States United was secretly advancing with the Manhattan Project, both Nazi Germany-like the Japanese Empire explored the possibility of developing their own atomic bomb. However, in some cases, the programs were limited, poorly organized, and ultimately a complete failure. In the German case, the project began in 1939, shortly after the discovery of the nuclear fission by Otto Hahn and Lise Meyer. Renowned physicists like Werner Heisenberg, Nobel Prize winner and one of the most brilliant theorists of their generation, they were summoned to investigate the military potential of nuclear energy. The effort became known as the Uranium Project. The research focused on the use of enriched uranium and water-heavy metal as a moderator in reactors experimental. German scientists, some progress was made, but they encountered insurmountable obstacles. No, they had sufficient access to uranium nor with industrial facilities capable of enriching it on a large scale. Furthermore, heavy water production in Norway was repeatedly sabotaged by Allied commandos and the Resistance Norway, thwarting any attempt serious about building an operational reactor. Some historians point out that the ambiguity of Eisenberg and other scientists also played a role. No, it was perfectly clear if they were looking for actually hand Hitler a weapon nuclear, or yes, in a veiled way. They avoided take a decisive step that would put the weapon most destructive in history in the hands of the Nazi regime. Be that as it may, when the war ended in 1945, Germany was far from developing an atomic bomb. In Japan, the effort was even more limited. Project Nigo, directed by physicist Yojin Sina in Thirine Institute and later the Project FGO, their objective was to investigate the feasibility of fission. Japan lacked adequate mineral resources, industrial infrastructure and, above all time, the country was devastated by Thea's naval blockade and the incendiary bombs, which is what it did. It's impossible to sustain a program like that. Magnitude. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki they were destroyed in August 1945 by American atomic bombs, the Japanese scientists understood that they were within striking distance of something similar. The contrast was overwhelming. While the United States managed in just 6 years to gather thousands of scientists, enormous resources and coordination without precedents, Germany and Japan never moved beyond the experimental phase. Axis nuclear projects were a combination of excessive ambition, technical limitations, and circumstances-adverse wars. Beyond the while there have been partial advances, the truth is that the Third Age and the Japanese Empire never were close to having a weapon operational nuclear. Its efforts they failed not only because of a lack of resources, but also by a deep disorganization and because of the fact that for 1934 both countries were already fighting simply to survive. Nazi Germany failed. Always a crucial element in his naval strategy, aircraft carriers. While the United States, Japan and the United Kingdom developed large fleets-embarked aerial vehicles capable of projecting power thousands of kilometers away from their coasts, the German Kriegmarine depended almost exclusively on battleships, cruisers, and submarines. For to fill that void, in 1936 he set out construction of the Zeppelin. Graf is underway, the first and only German aircraft carrier. With a length of 262 m and a displacement of 33,500 tons off displacement, it was designed for operate up to 40 aircraft, including fighter jets Messerschmitt Bf. 109 adapted and Yankee dive bombers and 87 Stucco in a naval version. The project was driven by German Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, and Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Krieg Marine. Without, however, problems soon arose. Germany had no experience in naval aviation, and aircraft adaptation from land-based to shipboard operations it proved extremely complex. Furthermore, the rivalry between the Luftwaffe and the Marine made sure there never was one clear strategy on how to use the aircraft carrier. Construction progressed slowly. By 1939, when the Graflin was approximately 85% complete. But instead of prioritizing thereupon completion, Hitler ordered a diversion resources towards submarines and tanks that were more urgent in the war effort immediate. The aircraft carrier remained abandoned in port, unfinished. In 1942 there was an attempt to resume the project, but the growing losses in the Eastern Front and the shortage of materials brought it to a standstill again. 1943, Hitler declared that he had no confidence in the aircraft carriers and ordered to stop definitely the program. The Graf Zeppelin was never finished nor entered combat. At the end of the war, the ship was captured by Soviet force in Stin, now Chechnya, Poland. Los Soviets examined it and used it in artillery and torpedo tests. Finally, in 1947, it was sunk in the Baltic Sea during military exercises. The Graf Zeppelin. This represents another clear example of how the grandiose projects of the Third Reich they never materialized. It was a ship impressive on paper, but doomed due to a lack of coordination, the struggles, internal conflicts between branches of the military, and the reality of a war that demanded other priorities. As the war was advancing and the hopes of a quick victory faded, the Nazi regime began to support projects increasingly unusual. Among them attempts to create weapons of note sound and directed energy. Ideas that today they seem to have been taken from science fiction, but which were explored seriously by some engineers Germans. One of these projects was called a sonic cannon. The idea was in generating sound waves extremely powerful, capable often disorient or even kill enemies at close range. The device consisted of parabolic reflectors that concentrated acoustic waves in a directed beam. Nazis hoped it could be used against troops or even aircraft. In Thane practice, the scope was very limited and superhuman physiological effects they were much lower than expected. Although some prototypes were tested, but a weapon was never developed functional nor deployed in combat. Another even more extravagant concept was the Sun Nengware or solar weapon. This project, promoted in the circles of technical science fiction of the time, I imagined a gigantic mirror parabolic telescope placed in orbit, capable of concentrate the sun's rays and destroy entire cities seen from space. The idea was based on optical principles acquaintances, but he was completely out of the technological reach of the 1940s. Never progressed beyond the sketch stage in the plans from some engineers enthusiasts. These projects illustrate to what extent was the regime willing to explore impossible paths just to keep the illusion alive. The Wunderwaffe. While the Army German suffered decisive defeats in all fronts, human resources and intellectuals were wasted on ideas without any practical application immediate. Years later, some of these projects fueled theories of conspiracy and myths about weapons secret Nazi powers almost supernatural. Reality is much more simple. Most were experiments failed, desperate attempts to looking for miraculous solutions in a moment when the rage no longer had exit. The chapter on weapons of sound and energy reminds us how in the World War II the border between real science and fantasy could blur when mixed desperation, propaganda, and unbridled ambition. While Japan invested resources in its U-boats, he sought an even bolder concept. 400 submarines, known as aircraft carrier submarines, designed to be the largest off-world in its time. These ships were capable of transporting 3 aircraft M6 bombers to Syren in hangar cylindrical, ready to take off using a catapult installed in the cover. The idea was that these submarines could sail in secreto enemy shores, emerge from surprise attacks and launch air strikes against strategic objectives. In particular, Japan dreamed of using them to bomb the Panama Canal, thus interrupting the connection between the Atlantic and Pacific and complicating the logistical effort of the States United. With a length of over 120 manned and extraordinary reach, they could give around the world without resupplying. The first 400s were genuine marvels of naval engineering. Size and autonomy far exceeded any submarine built up Tozo. However, these giants they emerged too late. The first, the I-400, was voted in December 1944, when the war was already practically lost for Japan. Although they were planned attacks against the Panama Canal and U.S. counterbases in Ulatai, the operations were cancelled due to the desperate situation of the empire and due to a lack of resources. In total, they only built 3 units operational: I-400, I-401 and I-402. None of them succeeded in completing their mission original. At the end of the war, they were captured by the United States Navy United. For a time, the Americans studied them with interest, since its size and concept were revolutionaries. Finally, in 1946, were deliberately sunk in the Pacific to prevent the Soviet Union would examine them within the framework of the tensions of the post-war period. The first 400s represent a clear example how technological innovation does not enough when a country finds itself at the verge of collapse. They were ships ahead of their time, with enormous potential, but born too late and in a context where nothing could change the course of the war. When we look at the big ones as a whole, secret Axis projects, the V3 cannon, the Mouse tank, the GRA aircraft carrier Zeppelin, the submarines and 400 or the nuclear programs, all share a central element: inevitable failure. The first cause was the lack of material resources. From 1943 onwards, both Germany and Japan suffered serious supply problems. The blockade. Allied naval forces limited the arrival of strategic raw materials such as oil, high-quality steel, or the uranium. Without enough fuel, without factories intact, and with transport the railway was bombed, it was impossible to build and mass deploy these weapons. The second cause was time. Most of the projects began later, when the military situation was already had deteriorated. The Mouse appeared in 1943, when Germany needed tanks light and fast, not 188 monsters tons. The submarines and 400R they launched in 1944, when Japan was already losing islands and naval bases are being built at an unstoppable pace. The German Uran projectile never went beyond the experimental phase because rage could sustain an effort of long-term research in the midst of total war. Another decisive factor. It was the poor coordination and rivalry internal. In Germany, the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine competed for resources and power, which led to duplications and blockades. The Graf Zeppelin suffered precisely because of that rivalry. Göring he never wanted to give up Luftwaffe Planesto the Navy. In Japan, the Army and the Navy maintained nuclear projects separated, which further weakened the effectiveness. Nazi propaganda spoke of constantly with miraculous weapons. Putin practiced these innovations. They absorbed resources that could have been already used in conventional weapons tested. While almost use, several Panzer could be manufactured for. While experimenting with cannon sonics, thousands of soldiers lacked basic ammunition at the front. The result was that instead of saving the Riga o all'Imperio, Stas Wunderwaffe, they accelerated their collapse. They fed illusions, but they did not resolve the fundamental problems of strategy, logistics, and industrial capacity. In retrospective view, the reality of failure is clear. None of these weapons were in a position to change the course of the war. They were too expensive, too complex, or too late. They served as symbols of a regime desperate man searching in technology what I could no longer obtain in the field of battle. Although the project secrets of the Third Reign and the Empire, the Japanese failed to change the course of the war, many of them left unexpected legacy. It wasn't the victory military, but the strategic lessons and technological, which survived its failure. First of all, these experiments showed the world the limits of military megalomania. The Mouse tank and the V3 cannon became classic examples of how not to invest resources in war. After 1945, the Allied armies they learned to value efficiency regarding size, prioritizing weapons practical and adaptable instead of excessive projects. On the other hand, some developments and marked the beginning of new technological eras. The designate the submarines and 400 anticipated the concept of strategic submarines' far-reaching impact that during the Cold War, they would become central pieces of nuclear deterrence. The Uran project, although unsuccessful, it showed the importance of a scientific coordination and large-scale logistics, a lesson that the United States successfully applied in the Manhattan Project. Even the projects that never made it past the phase prototypes, such as the Zeppelin Graf or the Armasonics, served as reminders that innovation without a clear strategy leads to failure. In military history manuals, they are studied today as warnings against the dispersion of resources across initiatives without practical viability. Beyond that, technically, these projects also left a cultural and symbolic legacy. They fueled myths, documentaries, novels and films that continue to fascinate public. The image of the project's Nazi secrets were transformed into a fertile ground for speculation and fiction, from conspiracy theories, even science fiction. But behind the myth lies a reality resounding. They were symbols of a desperate regime, incapable of to acknowledge that the war was lost. Ultimately, the legacy of the failures are twofold. On the one hand, they contributed to the advancement of technology, military and scientific. On the other hand, they reminded the world that no weapon miraculous can replace the strategy, logistics, and morale. Hitler's dreams and those of the Japanese Empire, they crashed into reality, but their remains helped shape the landscape military of the second half of the century XX. The secret projects of the Axis during World War II, they were the clearest expression of a regime desperate, willing to bet on any idea that could offer the illusion of an impossible victory. From the V3 cannon to the mouse tank, from the aircraft carriers that never set sail, even the submarines that arrived too late. Everyone shares a common destiny, to fail before changing the story. The propaganda promised miraculous weapons, but the reality was another one. Factories destroyed, resources exhausted. Exhausted soldiers and towns' entire areas in ruins. Science and the technology, however brilliant it may be, they could not compensate for the lack of strategy, coordination, and logistics. The legacy of these failures lives on. On one hand, they left behind technical teachings that inspired military development and post-war scientists. On the other hand, Hethy became a reminder that no invention can save a regime condemned from within. The Second World War II proved that war does not you don't win with grand dreams, but with preparation, organization, and resilience collective. The secret projects of Hitler and the Japanese Empire are today museum pieces, symbols of a past where technological fantasy collided against the harshest reality. And so the history teaches us a lesson timeless. No miracle weapon can changing the destination when the cause is lost.
Thank you for joining Historical Archives. Subscribe for weekly documentaries, forgotten stories, and legendary moments. Until next time, keep exploring history.